So as you know, and for those who are finding this conversation because we've posted it somewhere, if that ends up happening, we've been, this class that you are joining in on because of coronavirus is called The Bible and the Novel. And so we've been reading novels that riff on or pair with biblical texts and thinking about how modern fiction can help enliven us as readers to read more attentively, to pick up on the sort of dramatic and human nuances of the Bible. Because for a lot of us coming out of evangelical traditions or out of heavily church traditions, we know all the answers and we know the stories, and we know the story of Ruth and Naomi, and we've heard it our whole lives. And so it can be hard to read past what we already know and to find the real human drama. And so thinking about Ruth in this very big context we've put together, then we have two women who are starting out in kind of the most dire of circumstances. And we've paired this with Marilynne Robinson's Lila, which starts out with women during the Great Depression who are in very, very similar circumstances. Transient, homeless women, a woman who has kidnapped a young girl, although the young girl had basically been abandoned by her family, so it's not exactly kidnapping, but you end up with a 4-year-old and her adoptive mother who are homeless, who are wandering, working as migrant farm workers during the Great Depression. And really that's kind of been what we have here at the beginning of Ruth, is this idea of two women who are without any sort of social structure, any sort of support. They don't have access to, they can't just go get a job in an apartment and set up their nice life as a mother-in-law and daughter. They have nothing, and they are on the absolute margins of society, but they're also geographically then removed from their places of where they would expect to find support from their homeland. Right. So they've got nothing. And as we've talked about repeatedly in this course, women in the ancient world are really vulnerable without those support structures of husband, father, sons that provide economic resources, but also like social legitimacy. And so that's where we begin. And Naomi's kind of a funny character at the beginning of this, because she, is obviously quite broken over what has gone on in her life. And she tells her daughters-in-law to go. And of course, Orpah does, but Ruth doesn't. Ruth stays. And she goes through, the famous speech, right? We read it at weddings sometimes. And wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. This great sort of word of faithfulness. And I'm really interested in Naomi's response, because after all of that, Naomi says nothing. Like there's absolutely no response to Ruth. It's just, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her to go away. Like, yeah. What do we make of the sort of dynamics here? Ruth is almost overperforming loyalty in this moment, which kind of makes sense given that Naomi is literally the only person Ruth has left as well. Although she's still young and marriageable, so she could go back. So it's an interesting choice to make, to stick with Naomi. But Naomi's response to it of kind of okay. What's going on there, do you think?
One of the things Naomi does, I think, is try to be realistic and pragmatic, and to say that, look, not only can I not offer you anything, but reminding these daughters-in-law that she's also not obligated to give them anything, right? There's nothing there's nothing that they can or should expect of her.
Yeah.
And it makes very good sense. I think we sometimes see Orpah's decision as somehow less than a good decision. But especially in that kind of a context, and assuming that Moabite society is similar to ancient Israelite society, yeah, it makes absolutely good sense. And that is the best way that Naomi can take care of Orpah, is to send her back to her family.
Yeah.
That's the most caring thing Naomi can offer, the most security she can offer. And Ruth makes this incredible choice. to say, look, your vulnerability in this situation is my vulnerability. Where you die, there will I be buried.
Yeah.
I'll put everything on the line that you've put on the line, and then some, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, I think Ruth isn't just some idealistic, it's not, it sounds nice and all the rest of it, but Naomi has done her due diligence, right? Saying this is what our situation is.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we're vulnerable to. I can't do anything for you, and the best I can do for you is to send you back.
Yeah.
The same thing. And I think that's what makes Ruth's choice so remarkable.
Yeah.
It's such a dull word for what she does.
I mean, is there a way in which she's almost performing the sort of loyalty or commitment that Israel is called to, like this sort of, not necessarily, I mean, to God, obviously, but to each other, this sort of the sense of like, what does it look like to be Israel? It looks like even when everything else is stacked against you, even when the most practical thing to do is to abandon ship, go find yourself a new husband, that there's something to this like sticking together as a people and recognizing out of our shared vulnerability that we need each other, and that it's better to journey together in that shared vulnerability and brokenness than to just take the most pragmatic path if that means dissolving the community. I mean, there seems to be something very deeply human and really important in that, in terms of a lesson for what it means to be a people and what it means to form deep community ties.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, right? The rabbinic interpretation, the midrash on this, has this beautiful passage that says, the rabbis are really interested in reading biblical text for explaining how to do the Torah, right? If you take seriously that the covenant between God and Israel is this everlasting thing that binds God to the people and binds the people to their God, and that these are the terms by which the people live that out and know that they're doing that, then it's really absolutely essential, right, to study and understand, all right, if the law says, leave the corners of your field for the people to glean, you have to know exactly how to do that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
The law says this. How do you walk that out? What is the procedure? And that's why the rabbis look for halakha. The word has to do with the word for walking. It's the procedure of the law. It's the jurisprudence, all the argument that has to go through. If the Torah says this, great. Now, how do we do it, right? And then, how do we apply that in this situation versus that situation, and all the rest of that? And the rabbis, that's absolutely essential to being Israel for the rabbis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you look at the book of Ruth and the midrash, and they say, what does this have to teach us for how to do any of the law? And one of the responses is, it has nothing to do with ritual. It has nothing to do with law. It has nothing to do with any of these things, and except for the performance of chesed, of what's often translated loving kindness. We've alluded to this already as mercy. And that if for no other reason, that's why the book of Ruth is written. That's why the book of Ruth is received as scripture. It's to teach this understanding of the devotion that is necessary to Israel, not apart from the law for the rabbis,
right.
God forbid, but precisely to understand what is within the law of leaving the corners of your field for those to glean who don't have their own land because they didn't have a husband or a father or an ancestor, right, to attach them to that. And so that's one of the places where, right, can I do show and tell?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's that video, right?
So that's why I'm sitting here by my books. So the 6 orders of the Mishnah, right, are the sort of basic, earliest arrangement of rabbinic discussion of the law, and they're arranged topically, right? Because all the laws in the Torah kind of are framed in little segments within the narrative. And if you want to know everything there is about agriculture, for example, then you look at Mishnah Zeraim on seeds, and the second section of that has to do with, has to do with the corners of the.
Yeah.
All right. So this becomes a famous passage. It becomes actually part of the daily prayer every morning upon waking. These are the things for which the rabbis have searched through the Torah and find no limit, no prescribed amount set. And the first is peah, the corner of the field, right? And there's of other things, right? How much of your first fruit offerings, how much of the offerings when you're supposed to appear before the Lord 3 times a year. It doesn't say what or how much, just says nobody appears empty-handed. And then the Gemilut Chasadim, the doing of deeds of loving kindness, of chesed, the Talmud Torah, and the studying of Torah, right? So these are the things which there's no prescribed limit, as opposed to other things, right? Which the rabbis do see limits for, and then they have to figure out, like, okay, how much of this? So
generosity, loving kindness, and the study of Torah, you can never do too much of those 3 things.
Exactly.
And those 3 things seem very linked. I mean, think about generosity, and one of the great things about Ruth is it's very much the corners of the fields become so important to Boaz's chesed toward Ruth, right? Because how do you actually love someone? Well, oftentimes it comes in the concrete generosity of like being sure they have enough to eat. Exactly. And then the study of Torah, which informs us about kind of the infinite depth of God's love and richness for the community and for us, that then can motivate our generosity and actual concrete deeds of Hesed. So I really love that there's no limits. We can never do too many Bible classes. Just need to remember that for the new GE revisions at George Fox.
Yeah, that's often a common curriculum discussion. Yes.
They'll always need one more. It's also, so Ruth also then gives us, it helps to quite literally put flesh on what Hesed looks like then. If that's the whole purpose of the book, it's not just an abstract understanding of what it looks like to love the other, but it looks like, you know, who is the other? Well, it's Ruth, who's been widowed, and her elderly mother-in-law, who has also been widowed and is also sonless. It's these 2 actual people, which I think helps our imaginations, because it's so easy to have like the poor, the fatherless, you know, the widow. They're abstract categories. How do I care for them? But this is what it looks like. It looks like Boaz and Ruth and Naomi, just like real people doing real things. So the students have all read this in anticipation of us talking about it, and they had some questions for us, and there were a lot of questions around Ruth and Naomi. And a lot of them do come up around kind of Ruth's commitment. So I'm just looking over their questions here. Ruth's commitment to Naomi, especially there were some questions around kind of what motivates that. I think the students were picking up on that this is not the most practical course of action for Ruth. And so what underlies her motivation as a character to stick with Naomi? And like, what are we missing here? Is there something going on in the ancient world, or is it as remarkable and inexplicable as it seems? And we kind of talked about this a minute ago, but I mean, is there anything else to fill in, or is it just simply, no, actually Ruth's commitment to Naomi is hard to explain. There's something truly remarkable that's happening.
Yeah. Well, another thing I noticed in their questions was similarly Boaz's provision for Ruth, right? He doesn't just do the thing where he leaves the corners for her and says, okay, yeah, you can pick up whatever. He actually, you know, commands the leaving of, you know, pull out some stalks for her to pick up and things like that. And so in that sense, I think we're given a character in both Ruth and Boaz, but especially in Ruth, right, to make us ask that question. I think, from a literary point of view, why does Ruth do this?
Yeah.
You can go with all kinds of questions and attempts to explain it, but I think part of the purpose of the story is to make us just marvel in amazement at the incredible devotion that someone who doesn't owe anything to Naomi really has become so attached. I mean, I think of this even in terms of like my own. I have an aunt who is the widow of my uncle, and my uncle is my deceased uncle is my mother's brother. Yeah. And especially after my grandfather passed away, my aunt, who lived 20 minutes away, right, was really just very devoted and loyal and faithful to my grandmother in ways that really reminded me of Ruth and Naomi. In a way, maybe there are a lot of people who have stories like that, who can see relationships like that, and can see then in the Ruth story this incredible sense of care and devotion that is remarkable precisely because it isn't. Because people really care about each other, right? The list of duties is not part of the equation, right? It's what you do, right? And that's the idea, right? That somebody who didn't even know how to do all of the things, right, that the law required of her, and didn't even require of her since she's a Moabite, right? She's doing something that just automatically, because of her devotion to Naomi, elicits all these other things that the law, it activates the things that the law already has in place for Israel to be Israel. And it's not just about Ruth and Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, but it actually turns out to be the very thing that makes Israel Israel, because it produces, right, the dynasty of David and the Temple of Solomon and all the things that Israel has been and has hoped for and hopes for again, if you read that in the time of Ezra.
Yeah. So it's not, Chesed actually produces the law and produces Israel, even as the law helps us to understand what Chesed looks like in its day-to-day operations and what Israel looks like in their day-to-day operations. There's this kind of hermeneutic circle between the two that you can see, Chesed producing the works of the law, even if you don't know it, know what the law is, but the law also informing what that should look like. As you say, activating it, right? That Chesed actually kind of activates people to start doing what they're supposed to do according to Torah in this.
It's part of a rabbit hole to go into some of our other discussions. I wonder if, when I say that, if I might be influenced by one of the first century Pharisees who writes, even when non-Judeans do on their own the thing that the Torah requires, they demonstrate the Torah that they have already sort of, that even applies to them.
It applies to them, right.
I'm paraphrasing Paul in Romans, if your students didn't catch the reference. who's writing to non-Judeans who are joining Judeans. He doesn't have a category, I know I'm not saying this for you, but this is the problem with performative part of this. but right, that he doesn't have a category of something other than Judeans and not Judeans.
Right.
But now he has to come up with how to talk about these non-Judeans who've joined his Judaism.
Mm.
And so when he tries to understand what is the right relationship of them to the community to whom Torah does apply in all of its ways, he's looking for a way to understand that. And he says, oh yeah, when non-Judeans, when Gentiles do the things that the Torah requires of them, even though they don't have it, right? They're not supposed to have it.
Yeah.
They actually demonstrate, right, the incredible ways in which God's love and mercy extends to Israel and through Israel to the rest of the world. That's a really important idea for at least that reading of Paul's
right.
understanding of things.
So coming back to where our discussion kind of started with the tension between Deuteronomy and Ruth, it seems that what we're actually saying now is that because of the way that Ruth kind of fleshes out the idea of Hesed and shows us what that looks like and its relationship to Torah, that really what Ruth is kind of a celebration of the real life-giving nature of Torah that is grounded in this deep love for the other. And that this is a way of understanding that the way that Torah makes, actually creates space to create community. And that the law creates the sort of context in which loving kindness can exist in real ways, and also that loving kindness is where Torah flows from in the first place.
Yeah.
And so these are really, it's really a celebration of the goodness and the gift of Torah to the people. Is that a fair way to say it?
I think that fits really well, not just within like the context of Ruth, the story within the story, but the story around which, where scholars usually put it, right, with Ezra and the sort of tension, and also with the way that it becomes part of the larger thing. I think the other piece of where Ruth fits into, especially Jewish life, is that Ruth's words to Naomi become the words that a convert uses in the official conversion ceremony. So you mentioned that it's used in a lot of Christian weddings as a way of talking about the devotion between husband and wife. And it's very similar to the way that, the way in which the rabbis sort of use that metaphor, right, between God and Israel, and then the individual convert becomes sort of an individual model of that as well. So for those who are interested, Shia Cohen's The Beginning of Jewishness has a great chapter on the historical development of the rabbinic conversion ceremony. But it also raises the question for the rabbis in a very different context from Ezra or the ancient, the time of the judging of the judges, which is this time setting for Ruth. But it raises a lot of questions for how the rabbis are negotiating their own situation of who's in and who's out, and how do you make that official, and what constitutes community when there is no more Jewish autonomy in the land, and there is no more temple, and Jews are living in communities, throughout the ancient world. Yeah. And for the rabbis, for rabbinic Judaism, that's another reason why Torah is so central to understanding who is Israel. And so Ruth becomes a really, becomes reinterpreted in that context, right? As part of how do we negotiate not just the boundaries of the edges of who's in and who's out, but also how does that relate to sort of the center, the midpoint, the core of what it is to be.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I'm thinking too, as you were saying all that it's interesting then that this book is the book of Ruth and not the book of Boaz, right? And that, because I was thinking about some of the other strains that have come out in this class where we've seen time and again, whether it be with Tamar and Judah, who of course come up at the end of Ruth, with Bathsheba and David, with some of the things that go on with backtracking, but with Abraham and Sarah. I think a lot of times the biblical text, especially the Hebrew Bible, can get a bad rap in terms of the way that women are treated, but that tends to be from people who haven't actually paid a lot of attention to what's going on. Because there's always these interesting sort of moments of, I mean, don't get me wrong, the ancient world was a really horrible place to be a woman. And there are all sorts of moments where there are frustrating things that happen to women, obviously. I'm assuming a lot of knowledge here because of past class sessions, right? We've been over, like, it was not a good place for women. But that said, we see time and again, whether with like Judah and Tamar, this moment of, a woman kind of she is in a no-win situation. She is not being provided for in the way that she's supposed to be provided for socially, through her husband's family. And she kind of takes matters into her own hand. There's a lot of questions about, kind of what goes on. And yet the text doesn't seem to condemn her for any of that. And in fact, she ends up being kind of held up as the more righteous one.
Judah's, I mean, yes, it's problematic that her righteousness then gets adjudicated by the patriarch, but the text seems to agree with Judah's declaration. She is righteous, right? She is more righteous than I. She's in the right. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting how not just that narrative of how then you get Peretz, who's the son/grandson of Judah, who then is Boaz's ancestor, right? And then looking ahead, right, to the story of David and Uriah, who is the
Hittite,
right? Another non-Israelite who has a very important, prominent place in David's, warlording days. Once he becomes the king in Hebron and then in Jerusalem, he has, this retinue of people who have a place simply because of their devotion to David. And so David taking Bathsheba from Uriah becomes this incredible betrayal of Chesed.
Yeah, right.
It is so poignantly portrayed when he's confronted with the parable of the wealthy man who steals his poor neighbor's only sheep to the banquet, right? So that there is this sort of midpoint of like the righteousness of Tamar, right, in doing what she needs to do, and Judah's acknowledgement of that, and David's incredible betrayal, right, of the vulnerability, right, of supposedly this mighty important person, Uriah, who's an important guy in David's administration and army. And the way in which the righteousness of Tamar and the betrayal of David are both sort of not just then about how that very masculine-centered society thinks about what it is to be right and what it is to be loyal and what it is to be wrong and disloyal, but the way that affects the roles of the women in those stories. And I think Ruth kind of gives us this incredible midpoint. And to go back to something you said earlier about Naomi acknowledging that she has nothing, and that Ruth also has nothing. I think there might be a place then to push back on that in the story, right? As you were saying, right? We look at these stories and we say, oh, it really was horrible, right, for societies. I'm not sure how much. Some things are definitely better, but I'm not sure how much better things really are. We like to tell ourselves we're so much better.
Yeah.
The story seems to push back on that it only seems that they haven't. Yes, there are things that they don't have. Yes, there are things they don't have the resources, they don't have the status, they don't have all of these other things. But it's the agency that Ruth does exercise.
Right.
And her agency then is chesed. And it's chesed that becomes the thing that she has and that she has more of, right?
Right.
And gets more of, and then activates and receives, right? And then Boaz's chesed gets activated because she has begun with the one thing that she does have, which is her chesed, her devotion to Naomi. And it's just like how that becomes like this answer back to these stories of what's required and what's loyal.
Mm-hmm.
She's right there. It's like, that's all you need, right? And it's not all you need, but it's the beginning.